Just before we get started with the final session of the talk, I will say we did invite Jen Bohm, who Deshtu was talking about, the Klingon pop warrior. She doesn't have the license to stream her songs yet. Otherwise, she absolutely would have been here to do a performance during this LCC, but hopefully for the next one. I also want to give a quick shout out just before the last set of talks to the people who are helping put this on, sort of behind the scenes. Sai, as you've seen a few times, has been a major help with sort of the technological backdrop, probably at every LCC there's ever been. So Sai is in the background, making sure all of the YouTube videos are segmented and searchable, and helping me respond to comments on all of the various social media sites we have up, as well as live tweeting to take that one thing off of my plate, which I am grateful for. Daniel Newell, who was here on the Zoom earlier, but I don't think is anymore, helped me organize basically the entire conference, from selecting what weekend to do this on to figuring out what the best time zones were so we could accommodate an international audience, vetting the abstracts that we got, and was the relay master for the conlang relay that we will see tomorrow. And of course, the rest of the board of the directors of the LCS, from chiming in to, is an in-person conference going to be viable this year? When do we start sending out things? Vetting things last minute, giving advice, answering questions. All of the board members worked very hard on making sure this came together. So thank you to all of them as well. And finally, last but not least, all of the participants, from the panelists, the presenters, and the people talking about their personal conlangs. Obviously, we would not be doing this without you. So there we have it. I'm starting 1 minute late. I'm sorry. Cohen, if you give me 1 second here, I'm going to give you the ability to share your screen. You should have that now. So if you have slides, you can go full screen with those.
Okay. It says host disabled participant screen sharing.
I could have sworn I just gave it to you. Let me try it again. Now you definitely should.
All right.
There we go. So this is our second last talk of the day. We'll be back with more tomorrow. But Cohen Root, I'm not going to try and pronounce your conlang. I'll let you take that away.
All right. Thank you very much. So yes, my name is Cohen Root. I am giving my presentation, Ayiwa, a failed experiment in controlled pidginization. But before I do that, some brief acknowledgements. I would like to thank the Language Creation Society in its entirety for helping fund and hosting this talk. Elmira College for also giving a grant when this experiment was being run in 2019. David J. Peterson for giving tips and help and advice early on when I was getting started organizing this. Taylor Kibler 21, my fellow moderator when I was running this. Dr. Robin O'Brien, who helped me get Anthropology credit for this. And of course, the 5 anonymous participants in the experiment, who I will talk about later. A little bit about myself real quick. I am a philosophy, religious studies, and sociology anthropology student at Elmira College. I started constructing languages in 2016. I was at the time a creative writer on Tumblr looking for writing inspiration, and then I stumbled on David's blog, and I was like, you could do that? You could just make a language? And so that led me to his website, David J. Peterson's Web Thing, which includes a documentation of sorts for Language X, not to be confused with his other language project called X, and Wasabi. And before I talk about those, just real quick groundwork. A pidgin is a language created by 2 or more groups of people who need to communicate, but for one reason or another won't learn each other's languages. This is especially common in the European colonial context, where European settlers would need to speak to the local population, but they wouldn't learn their languages, nor would they set up educational institutions to teach those languages. But it also happened in more innocent contexts, like when foreign traders would be moving across great distances and they had a certain clientele they frequented. And the interesting about a pidgin is that it's a very simple language. All of the phonology and phonotactics have been stripped down. All of the complex morphology is gone. All of the complex syntax is gone. And so you have what is effectively just the core base of a language. And so anyone who's interested in auxiliary languages or like the origins of simple language naturally might be very interested in this kind of work. But the problem is we don't really have any good knowledge about how they emerge. We just know roughly how long it takes and a little bit of evidence, because it's really hard to document a pidgin. It's kind of allergic to documentation. And Language X and Wasabi were attempts to create the circumstances under which something like a pidgin might arise. The two experiments had roughly the same outline. A group of college students would receive a word list with one-to-one English glosses, but there were no grammar rules whatsoever to this language given, and the students were told to communicate using the word list. And the hope was that the resulting language would have certain pidgin-like qualities, but it tended not to. Instead, what tended to be the result was a relex of English with some interesting qualities. And the reason for this was largely because all participants spoke English. And apparently when you're just handed a list of words and told to translate into that language without any grammar, you try to do a one-to-one, word-by-word translation into your native language using those words. And the only time anything really interesting would happen is when words that aren't on the word list but are very necessary for speaking a native language aren't there. So in all of the word lists, like some of the common auxiliary verbs like to be and to have, which are fundamental to English grammar, weren't present. So interesting workarounds had to be done, either giving words new meanings or restructuring sentences to avoid those. Similarly, participants spent at most a few hours a week interacting with the word list, and they didn't memorize the word list, which led to utterances taking a very long time to produce, which also provided opportunities for miscommunication. And there was little in the way of internal or external motivation just because of the way that the experiments were structured. I'd like to iterate that all these criticisms are listed on David's website, and I recommend anyone who's interested to go read up what he has to say about them. He goes into much more depth on how they work. And I wanted to see if there's any way, in particular, to fix the motivation issue, and also to provide a context in which taking a little while to come up with a response makes sense. And the answer to that was to pay the participants and to have all of the writing done in a group chat where people can see the messages. I understand that this is a controversial decision. I'll talk about that a little later. As far as the setup for the experiment goes, both Elmira College and the Language Creation Society pitched in $250, for which I am grateful. And the Language Creation Society put in actual money, while Elmira College gave it to me in gift cards. And so the way I split it amongst the participants was I assigned 1 point to every single complete sentence written and submitted by one of the participants. And then I gave out the Language Creation Society money proportionately to how many points they had. So if person A had 200 points because they had made 200 complete sentences, and person B had 100 points because they made 100 sentences, then person A would get twice as much money as person B. And at the end of the experiment, all of the money was divvied up amongst the participants. And then everyone who made it to the end of the experiment got a cut of the gift card money. And the way the actual experiment worked was every day for 25 days, a prompt would be put into the group chat, and the participants would have 1 day to send in their answer to the prompt. So an example would be, say hello and introduce yourself, which is the very first prompt. Open enough to allow some level of expression, but closed enough so that everyone was talking about the same topic. And 5 of these days, well, in theory 5, a handful we had to miss, participants would participate in more intensive exercises, where we generally play some kind of language game for about an hour or two, and it would produce a lot more data than a standard prompt. And so the result, we ended up having about 260-ish lines, I remember, of text. 30 students expressed interest in participating. Of the ones that expressed interest, 5 attended the first meeting and 4 made it all the way to the end. These were briefly Alulu, a 22-year-old man studying psychology, criminal justice, and human services; Aya, a 19-year-old non-binary individual studying education; Mafafuyini, a 19-year-old woman studying psychology; Pakifu, a 22-year-old man studying political science, specifically international studies, and sociology anthropology; and Umisu Amila, a 20-year-old man studying education and biology. I wanted, of course, to go over every single line in excruciating detail, but I don't have the time for that. So instead, we're going to cover the first 5 verses of the Babel text that was translated. The first 2 in some detail, and the last 3 in not as much detail. And this should give all of the major lessons of the experiment without having a ton of extra material in there. Verse 1, for those who are unfamiliar, now the whole earth had one language and the same words. As mentioned earlier, the main translation tactic in this experiment, as much as the last 2, was get as close as possible to a literal word-for-word translation of English. The word order was nearly identical. All of the word choices were as close to identical as possible. You can see this in the word had. In 3 of the 4 instances, the auxiliary verb had was translated with hold. Even though this doesn't make a lot of sense outside of the idiomatic English expression to have a language. And only one person used no, which is a little closer to what we literally do when we are able to use a language. Similarly, there were no conjunctions on the list. So at the end, when you have and the same words, what was generally done is the conjunction was skipped and either a piece of punctuation was left there to make a sentence fragment or a clause, or it was same word was just lopped onto the end. And lastly, there was no tense marking, which in itself wasn't particularly interesting. But what is interesting is that when there were temporal words, they were literally translated. So in every case, the word now was translated as either this time, or at this time, which is also interesting because within the context of Genesis 10 leading into Genesis 11, now actually has more of a meaning like then, right? This event is the direct result of this previous event. So moving on to verse 2, and as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Shinar was left untranslated in all of the examples because early on in the experiment, it was pretty clear that the participants didn't really know what to do with proper nouns. Originally, I wanted them to be kind of creative about it if they could, and I tried to encourage that, but it just wasn't happening. So I allowed borrowing in proper nouns without having to do anything to them. No one tried to, I don't believe anyone ever tried to make the phonology and phonotactics match. So like turning Shinar into Sina or Sinala. And no one tried to ever creatively translate any of the proper nouns. Like no one tried to like say Shinar is like the land between rivers or something like that, the land of the big river or something like that. Pluralization was the only affix that was consistently translated in some idiolects of the language. And it was always translated as fisisu, which is many, nafuli, which is all, or it was just completely ignored, even on pronouns, which kind of surprised me. I'm sure there's anidu for having no number marking whatsoever for pronouns, but I thought that there would be at least some attempt to like make a distinction between I and we. As far as 2 and 4, they were translated with usupi and yana, which are literally the numbers 2 and 4, which could only have happened because they're partially homophones in English and because they're common abbreviations in text speak. If you want to use the preposition, but you don't want to write out a whole 3 letters, you can write the number instead. But every once in a while, there'd be these little gold nuggets where there wouldn't be something on the word list, so people would have to get really creative. 2 examples from this verse were to settle, which was translated in one case as make house, so you make houses in Shinar when you settle there, or ufisa, which is the verb to lie down, as in to lie down in a bed, which I also found to be very interesting. When you settle somewhere, you're lying down there. And every once in a while, I think this is what interested me the most about the whole experiment. There'd be these little idiomatic gold nuggets. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the rest of the Babel text, but I'll cover a handful of these little gold nuggets here. Verse 3, the bricks that the Tower of Babel are made of. Only 2 of the participants tried to translate the word brick, and in both times, the bricks were red. Either they were red rocks or hard red squares, which implies that the archetype for a brick in the minds of these participants was red. And every once in a while, we get little results like that where we could pick out the archetype for the translation from how they translated it. In verse 4, something I haven't mentioned yet is that the Babel text was the only prompt that was not sent out in the group chat for everyone to see. And this was because at this point in the experiment, people were rather tired, and they were also towards the end of the term, like towards finals. So I didn't want someone to go through the work of translating the Babel text and then have everyone else file off the serial numbers and just repost it with like a handful of differences so it didn't look like they cheated. But in all 4 cases, city was translated as many house, which would be identical in most cases to the plural for houses, which means that many can also be a collective suffix, or it was used as a prefix. It'd be a collective prefix. The only case in which it was differentiated, Mafafuyini said many house place, or place of many houses, which I thought was really interesting. And that might imply that constructions were never actually borrowed from each other, but were actually just like spontaneously arrived to because it seemed like the path of least resistance in all 4 cases. As for verse 5, my main field is religious studies, so I have to nerd out a little bit about how they translated Lord. Lord in the Old Testament is the English translation for the Tetragrammaton. And each translation attempt got at a facet of what it means to be God in Abrahamic religion, but none of them got close to getting to all of them. Only one of them actually referred specifically to like power and authority that would be associated with the word Lord, and that was Umisu's strong one. But Alulu said person of make, which is interesting for 2 reasons. One, because it's maker, which implies that person of is an affix to describe a person who does something. So affixes were being generated, not just like the plural, which are necessary. It also assigns personhood to God, which is a controversial statement, even in some variants of Christianity. And the last 2 translated Lord as Skyman, which anyone who's familiar with the etymological roots of various god kings will know that this is actually kind of normal. One of them said big Skyman as opposed to just Skyman. It is also important to note that there were different words for man, person, and the 3rd singular pronoun. So there was an intentional decision to use the word man and gender God. Now, what was learned about language? Probably nothing. There was nothing in this experiment that happened that didn't already happen in language X or Wasabi, excluding details that were based on the peculiarities of the format of the experiments and the word list given out. But about the experiment, we also didn't learn much, but we did learn enough. So if someone at home wants to try this, I have a handful of tips. If you want to run this with one shared language, don't use English. We've already had this experiment done 3 times now, at least, in English. And every time the results have been almost identical. So you'd have to fundamentally alter the experiment in order to get different results out of English speakers. I am interested to see what would happen if this was run with native speakers of a synthetic language, not necessarily, like really brutal polysynthesis, but even like Turkish, right, an agglutinative language with lots of affixes. It'd be interesting, I think, to see which affixes would get translated and if they would be glued onto roots or not. Similarly, it'd be interesting to recruit from Esperanto forums and communities, because Esperanto speakers, there's a higher likelihood that they will have native languages separate from each other. And so you might get interesting features where people are defaulting to their native language, or they might default to Esperanto. And I think it'd be interesting to see which one gets picked, and if Esperanto wins out over time, just out of like sheer the fact that everyone knows it, and eventually they'll realize it. Um, Now, running this experiment with no shared language is probably the best way to do it, and it's probably the only way to get productive results in a linguistic context. And the way you would do this, it's also the hardest way. You need to get a team of volunteer moderators who use a shared language to organize the experiment. Each moderator has to know at least one other language, and they need to recruit a handful of people who speak that language. Then you need to vet all of the subjects to make sure that they are able to participate, and then you need to make sure that none of them overlap with languages. And then you need to make sure that they all live in similar time zones so that they can actually participate with one another. And then you run the experiment with each moderator translating the prompts so that each subject gets a prompt in their language without ever learning that the other subjects don't speak that language. So they will then try to translate into their native language, most likely, and then we can get some of the interesting grammatical generation that we might see arise in pidgins. So, like, for example, if you have a German speaker who really insists on using articles and no one else wants to use articles, and let's say they turn demonstratives into articles and that catches on, that's the kind of thing that I was looking for when running this experiment and almost never happened. As far as prompts go, they have to be synchronous and they have to be engaging. I understand that asynchronous prompts, like we did most of the time, are tempting, but the simple fact of the matter is that it'd be very difficult to get people to meaningfully conversate with one another unless they know that they are reading their responses in real time as they are being sent. And whatever it is, try to make sure the prompts are as fun as humanly possible. Of course, for the first week or two, it's going to be a slog as people figure out what they're doing. But over time, as more shared constructions start to emerge, you'll be able to introduce more and more complicated language games. Lastly, as for runtime, we only ran for 25 days. Longer is better. Run straight until you run out of resources. Keep going longer if humanly possible. If people are interested in just using the language, like they build a small community around speaking their pidgin, cool, keep it going. Keep recording their responses. Try to get them to teach it to you. That'll add a lot of interesting data. Now, with all that said, hopefully I'm under time. This is my email address, croot21@elmira.edu. Please contact me if you're interested in running the experiment or you have any other questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cohen. I think you're basically right on time, but I know I started you late, so I want to give you the chance to answer at least one of the questions. I think you answered the first couple that were posted in the YouTube chat, but I'll mispronounce this name. Oswix asks, isn't the point of a pidgin that there is no shared language, or does that not matter for a forced pidgin? What is the main goal or question behind the experiment?
Yes, that is the point. Which is why I think that if someone is to run this experiment again, like I said, they'd have to use a shared language of some kind, or they'd have to not have a shared language if they want to produce some kind of productive result. Originally, when I was just starting this out, I didn't necessarily have a clear goal in mind. I just wanted to see if I could improve on the experiment more so than could I get valuable linguistic information, because I knew I wouldn't actually have the resources to do that. So I wanted to see how text chat and paying the participants worked. I think paying the participants works. And I also think that the group chat is still the best way to do it, even though, as I'm sure you're aware, pidgins aren't a written phenomena, which will definitely alter the nature of the data. But I can't think of any feasible way to get the participants to memorize the word list unless you have a very specific like kind of polyglot who enjoys just like memorizing flashcards.
Thanks, Cohen. There are a couple extra questions coming up, such as things about signed pigeons, which would be cool if you want to pop over to the YouTube chat and interact with some of the people there. I'm going to get ready to bring Matthew up for the final talk of the day. But just as we switch things out, I do want to add that Cohen's experiment was at least partially funded by an LCS grant, and we do have a couple of these types of grants that are available. So the one that Cohen applied for successfully was just on our website. You can contact us for a grant. These are typically quite small grants, and they're to fund small initiatives that typically aren't they don't promote a single conlang, but they could promote conlanging more generally, or the teaching of conlanging. So post-lockdown, if anyone has an opportunity where they're able to teach conlanging or aspects of conlanging, or need funds to use conlanging in an educational purpose, they are there. Or if you're going to provide tools for the community of some variety, we will consider proposals for grants in that nature. And in addition to that, we also have the LCS President Scholarship. There's so far only one intake a year for that, though we could be a little flexible with it. So at the end of every year, we accept proposals from people who are undertaking some form of academic study on or using conlangs. And the President's Scholarship is just a flat, you're doing this, we're going to give you a scholarship for 500 USD, which is fairly new. We announced the first two recipients last year. Deshtu was one of them for his work on fine art conlanging as a master's thesis, and another recipient whose name I can't recall, out of British Columbia, who was looking at conlanging as an outlet to help mental health, if I remember correctly. And then we just awarded two more LCS President Scholarships back in January. One was a bachelor's student in Russia who is doing a linguistic thesis looking at certain syntactic semantic aspects of conlangs, and looking across a breadth of conlangs to see how some of those aspects are realized. And the second one was an opera that is partly being written in a conlang, again as a Master of Fine Arts thesis, I believe.